My baptismal name is Egaeus. My family name I will not tell. There were no towers in the land more time-worn than my gloomy hereditary halls. For many years, my line had been called a race of visionaries. There was evidence enough for that belief. It was in the old mansion itself, in the faded frescoes, in the tapestries of the sleeping rooms, in the armory, in the gallery of antique portraits, and, most of all, in the strange fashion of the library, and in the nature of the books it contained. My earliest memories are bound to that room and to its volumes. There my mother died. There I was born. I will not argue whether the soul has a life before birth. I was convinced of it, but I do not ask anyone else to be convinced. I only know that, from the first, I seemed to wake from a long night into a palace of imagination, into a wild domain of monastic thought and old learning. It is not strange that I looked around me with a startled and ardent eye. It is not strange that I wasted my boyhood among books and dissolved my youth in reverie. What was strange was what came later. As the years rolled on and manhood found me still in my father's house, the springs of my life grew stagnant. The common order of my thoughts inverted itself. The realities of the world affected me only as visions, while the ideas of dreams became not merely the matter of my daily life, but that life itself. Berenice and I were cousins. We grew up together in the halls of my father's, yet we grew in opposite directions. I was sickly, inward, and buried in gloom. She was agile, graceful, overflowing with energy. Hers was the path over the hillside, mine was the cloistered study. I lived inside my own heart, given body and soul to painful meditation. She passed through life almost carelessly, with no thought of the shadows in her path or of the silent hours flying over her. Berenice. I call her name, and from the grey ruins of memory 1,000 troubled images rise at once. I can see her as she was in those early days of light and joy, a strange and radiant beauty, a figure of gardens, fountains, and sunlight. Then all becomes mystery. Then all becomes terror. Disease fell upon her body like a hot and fatal wind. Even while I watched her, the spirit of change moved through her mind, her habits, her character, and at last through the very identity of her person. The destroyer came and went. The victim remained. But where was Berenice? I knew her no longer. Or if I knew her no longer as Berenice. Among the many disorders produced by that first fatal disease, the most distressing was a form of epilepsy. It often ended in a trance so deep that it resembled death itself. Her return from those states was usually abrupt, and it frightened those who saw it. During this time, my own disease also grew upon me. I have been told that I should call it by no other name. It was my disease, and it took a new and extraordinary form. It became a monomania. It seized the part of the mind that fixes attention. It did not make me dream broadly or imagine freely. It fastened me to one object, however small, until that object seemed to swell into an unreal and terrible importance. I could spend long hours absorbed in a mark on the margin of a book, in the shape of printed letters, in a shadow crossing the tapestry, in the steady flame of a lamp, or in the embers of a fire. I could lose whole days over the perfume of a flower. I could repeat a common word until the sound itself emptied of meaning. I could sit motionless until all sense of movement and almost all sense of bodily existence seemed to vanish. These were not pleasant reveries. They were not the luxurious wanderings of an imaginative mind. In an ordinary daydream, the first object is soon forgotten, and thought travels into a wilderness of suggestions. With me, it was otherwise. The original object remained. It returned again and again, always to the center. At the end of such meditation, it had not disappeared. It had grown monstrous. My books, too, fed the disorder. Their strange and speculative nature reflected the disease back into me. My reason did not yield to great shocks. It trembled instead before trifles. One might suppose that Berenice herself, altered so fearfully by illness, would have become the natural object of this morbid attention. But at first it was not so. In my clearer intervals, her suffering did pain me. I thought bitterly of the ruin of her fair and gentle life. I wondered how such a change could have come so suddenly upon her. But those thoughts were ordinary human thoughts. They belonged to grief, not to my disease. My disorder remained true to itself. It did not revel in her tragedy as a whole. It fixed instead upon the smaller, more startling changes in her physical form, and upon the dreadful distortion of her identity. Even in the brightest days of her beauty, I had never loved her as other men love. In the strange anomaly of my existence, my feelings were not of the heart. My passions were of the mind. In the grey of morning, in the shadows of the forest at noon, in the silence of my library at night, she had passed before my eyes. Yet I had not seen her as the living Berenice. I saw her as a dream, not as a being of the earth, but as the abstraction of such a being, not as something to admire, but as something to analyze, not as an object of love, but as the subject of wandering and obscure speculation. And now I shuddered in her presence. I grew pale when she approached. Yet she had loved me long, and, in an evil hour, bitterly pitying her fallen condition, I spoke to her of marriage. The time of our marriage was drawing near. One winter afternoon, the weather had turned strangely warm, calm, and misty. I sat in the inner apartment of the library. I believed myself alone. Then I lifted my eyes, and Berenice stood before me. I could not tell what made her figure seem so unnatural. Perhaps it was my own excited mind. Perhaps it was the mist in the air, the uncertain twilight of the room, or the grey draperies falling around her. Perhaps she had truly grown taller since her illness. She did not speak. I could not have spoken for worlds. An icy chill passed through me. An unbearable anxiety oppressed me. A consuming curiosity filled my soul. I sank back into my chair and remained breathless, motionless, my eyes fixed on her body. Her emaciation was extreme. No trace of the former Berenice seemed to remain in any line of her form. At last, my burning gaze fell upon her face. Her forehead was high, pale, and strangely calm. Her once golden hair had darkened, falling over hollow temples in black, fantastic curls. Her eyes were lifeless, and without light. I shrank from that glassy stare and looked down at the thin, shrunken lips. They parted, and in a smile of peculiar meaning, the teeth of the changed Berenice slowly revealed themselves. Would to God I had never seen them, or, having seen them, that I had died. The shutting of a door disturbed me. I looked up. Berenice had left the chamber. But from the disordered chamber of my brain, the white and ghastly image of her teeth did not depart. It would not be driven away. Not a speck upon their surface, not a shade upon their enamel, not a line in their shape, not a small break along their edges. Nothing had escaped me in that moment of her smile. I saw them now more clearly than I had seen them then. The teeth. The teeth. They were here, and there, and everywhere, visible, palpable, before me. Long, narrow, and intensely white, with the pale lips twisting around them, as they had in the first terrible instant of revelation. Then came the full fury of my monomania. I struggled against it in vain. Of all the objects in the external world, I had thoughts only for the teeth. Everything else, every interest, every concern, was absorbed into their single contemplation. They alone were present to my mental eye. They became, in their isolated individuality, the essence of my inner life. I held them in every light. I turned them in every attitude. I studied their characteristics. I dwelt on their peculiarities. I pondered their shape. I imagined a change in their nature. At last I shuddered as I gave them, in imagination, a sensitive and sentient power. Even without the lips, they seemed capable of expression. I remembered the old saying that every step of a dancer could be a feeling, and of Berenice, more terribly, I believed that all her teeth were ideas. Ideas. The evening closed in around me. Then darkness came, and stayed, and passed. Day returned, and another night gathered its mists around the chamber. Still I sat motionless in that solitary room. Still I sat buried in meditation. Still the phantasm of the teeth maintained its terrible ascendancy, floating with vivid and hideous distinctness through the changing lights and shadows. At last, a cry broke violently into my dreams. It was a cry of horror and dismay. After a pause, I heard troubled voices and many low moans of sorrow or of pain. I rose hurriedly from my seat and opened one of the library doors. In the antechamber stood a servant girl, all in tears. She told me that Berenice was no more. An epileptic fit had seized her in the early morning. She had fallen dead. And now, as night closed in, the grave was ready for its tenant. All preparations for burial had been completed. With a heart full of grief, yet reluctant, oppressed with awe, I made my way to the chamber of the dead. The room was large and very dark. At every step within its gloomy space, I encountered the objects of the grave. The coffin, a servant whispered, lay behind the curtains of the bed. And in that coffin, he told me, was all that remained of Berenice, who asked me whether I would look upon the body. I saw no lips move, yet the question had been asked. Its echo still seemed to linger in the room. It was impossible to refuse. With a sense of suffocation, I dragged myself to the side of the bed. Gently, I lifted the dark curtains. As I let them fall, they descended upon my shoulders. They shut me out from the living and enclosed me in the strictest communion with the dead. The very atmosphere smelled of death. The odor of the coffin sickened me. I imagined that another poisonous odor was already rising from the body. I would have given worlds to escape, to breathe again the pure air of the heavens, but I had no power to move. My knees trembled beneath me. I remained rooted there, staring at the rigid body stretched out in the dark coffin without a lid. God of heaven! Was it possible? Was it my brain that reeled, or did the finger of the shrouded dead truly stir beneath the white cloth that bound it? Frozen with unspeakable awe, I slowly raised my eyes to the face of the corpse. There had been a band around the jaws. I do not know how, but it was broken. The livid lips were drawn into a kind of smile, and through the surrounding gloom, once again, in too palpable a reality, there glared upon me the white, glistening, ghastly teeth of Berenice. I sprang from the bed. I spoke no word. I rushed from that apartment of horror, mystery, and death. I found myself sitting again in the library. Again, I was alone. It seemed I had just awakened from a confused and agitated dream. I knew it was midnight. I knew that since sunset, Berenice had been buried. But of the dreary interval between those two facts, I had no definite understanding. Its memory was full of horror, made more horrible because it was vague. Its terror was more terrible because it remained ambiguous. It was a fearful page in the record of my existence, written over with dim, hideous, unintelligible recollections. I tried to decipher them, and failed. Again and again, like the ghost of a departed sound, the shrill cry of a female voice seemed to ring in my ears. I had done a deed. What was it? The chamber seemed to answer me. What was it? On the table beside me burned a lamp. Near it lay a little box of ebony. It was not remarkable. I had seen it often before. It belonged to the family physician. But how had it come there, upon my table? Why did I shudder when I looked at it? There was no answer. My eyes fell at last upon the open pages of a book, and upon a sentence underlined there. Its meaning was simple. My companions had told me that visiting the grave of my beloved might bring some small relief to my sorrow. Why, when I read those words, did the hairs of my head rise? Why did the blood in my body freeze? A light tap came at the library door. A servant entered on tiptoe, pale as a man from the tomb. His eyes were wild with terror. His voice was low, trembling, and broken. I heard fragments. A cry in the silence of the night. The household gathering. A search in the direction of the sound. Then his voice became horribly distinct. He spoke of a violated grave, of a disfigured body found at its edge. A body wrapped in its shroud, yet still breathing, still palpitating, still alive. He pointed to my clothes. They were muddy and clotted with blood. I did not speak. He gently took my hand. It was marked by the impress of human nails. Then he directed my attention to an object against the wall. I looked at it for several moments. It was a spade. With a shriek, I bounded to the table and seized the ebony box. I could not force it open. In my trembling, it slipped from my hands. It fell heavily and burst apart. From it, with a rattling sound, rolled instruments of dental surgery, and with them scattered across the floor, 32 small, white, and glistening things. You have been listening to Strange Archives. If this file held your attention, subscribe to the channel. The next archive may be one that should have stayed closed.